Hello, everyone. We are back again for another episode of the Corona Time podcast. This is episode number 15, where we will be discussing the 1988 anime Grave of the Fireflies. So, this is the second anime movie that we will be reviewing on this channel. To give context, this movie revolves around sort of events that happened in Japan around World War II. From the perspective of a brother and sister. And yeah, so we'll be discussing a lot of the context, sort of the historical context that Japan was feeling towards World War II around that time. But yeah, Chris, so let me hear some of your original thoughts. I know you've seen this movie a long time ago when you were a kid, and this is my first time watching this movie. But yeah, did anything change from in terms of your feelings from the first time watching this film?
I actually will answer that question. Like I did. I think in the sense that the first time I watched it, like there were some scenes that I totally had forgotten about. Like I didn't know they happened. But the emotional scenes, they probably hit you harder than it did me because I remember those. Mm-hmm. But like some of the little details I was picking up, those were refreshing. But like some of like I know which scenes were like the hard hitting ones that are sad and everybody talks about them. They didn't hit me as hard this time around. What's interesting is that the first time I saw it, I was at the beginning of my, like, let's say anime journey. And I didn't know much, like I didn't have the knowledge I have today. So like a lot of the, like my perspective on the movie actually shifted a little bit. And we can get into this because when I first saw it, I thought it was like a clear anti-war movie. And now I see the subtler meanings of this movie. I still think it's an anti-war movie, but I think I was reading some Takahata, who is the director, some of his interviews. He actually explicitly says that like he didn't like come with the intention to make it a purely anti-war movie. He was actually afraid that like pro-war people and anti-war people would hijack what his messages were in this movie. Mm-hmm. And so the second time viewing it, I think I picked up on that because I think the first time obviously I was probably like 10 or 11. I think I fell into the normal like, kid, take it as you see it, being educated in the Western education system. But the second time, and we will get into this, I hope, I think I picked up some of these nuances that I think are going to lead to some interesting topic points. All right. Anyways, I'm interested about your take about like seeing it for the first time, especially with like a let's say, hardcore anime, catalog. Like, I'm curious about like what you got out of it because I get the feeling that we're going to be a little bit different here now.
Yeah, so it's kind of interesting because there's been very few movies that, growing up in the U.S. because we're both Americans, we both have different ethnicities, but we both grew up here in the States. So we sort of see things through the lens of Americans, especially in regards to like films of World War II. These are not animes, but like Saving Private Ryan, Flights for Our Fathers. These are a couple films that really give you sort of the American perspective and impact on World War II because that was such a big event in world history, right? And so it's interesting. There's been very few movies or films in the U.S. where you really see the perspective of like how other cultures were felt. There was I can't remember I think it was Letters from Iwo Jima was the only other sort of World War II film that sort of focused on the Japanese soldiers' side. But I haven't seen a movie that specifically dealt with some of the themes and topics of how Japanese society was dealing with, the ramifications of what was going on during World War II. So it was really interesting to see some of those aspects and how the sort of Japanese culture and society treated individuals that really lost everything, and how that basically how society would treat people who had lost a lot of stuff during the war, or like people who were homeless. Japanese citizens had a very different, I would say, perspective than we would have in the U.S. I thought a lot of those sort of interactions, especially with the aunt, were really interesting to me because you wouldn't necessarily see that in the U.S. or like expect people to come with those attitudes. Like in the U or in Japan, they're a very sort of honor-based society, right? You don't show any disrespect to your elders, and to an extent, I guess we have that here, but it's nowhere near to that extreme level as in Japan. Um, and you see some of the actions that even the two take, Seda and Setsuko, especially leaving their aunt's house. Basically, I don't think, and that really confuses a lot of American and Canadian and Australian audiences that watch this film. They were really confused and perplexed as to that decision, whereas when they showed this film to Japanese audiences, they completely understood. So it's really interesting seeing some of the cultural differences in this film.
Okay. Yeah. So that was one of the aspects I think that is important to highlight, that, you know, because the ant, we'll get into that in a second.
Sure.
But I want to highlight before that. So the director Takahata, he's from the same era of anime directors as Miyazaki. And this is the first era of directors that are kind of like, they're the ones that are the most traumatized by what happened in World War II. So I think sometimes, even though they say like, oh, this isn't an anti-war film,
it is.
I think it is. But I think from a critique of, I think some of the problematic maybe aspects of Japanese culture, which is, and we'll get into one of the themes I think is powerful in this movie, which is pride. And I think we'll talk about it in a sec. But we also, the movie we did before, Oshi's the generation after. And so Oshi is actually more affected by, I think, the Japanese economy collapsing in the 80s and 90s. And then I don't know if we'll cover like newer films, but newer films I think are more focused on some of the environmental aspects, and also kind of like what is the 21st century identity of a Japanese nation, which we can leave that for another day. But
just real quick, just before you get into it, I think, I do agree with your assessment of some of the environmental issues, because they did have that big nuclear power plant meltdown. I think that really did affect Japan as a society.
Oh, that definitely affected Japan as a society. But to your point, like going back to how like I think people can get confused about the relationship between like the aunt and supposedly her own family members, even though she viewed them as like like, how do I say this correctly? Like she viewed them as like kind of like extra baggage. And the kid ends up leaving. So, or the Seita and Setsuko, the brother and the sister, end up leaving. And I'm jumping around a little bit, but I think that's an interesting point to highlight, because I think like to your point, which is correct, is that I think a lot of us who don't understand like how that culture sometimes thinks, you would think it's totally foreign, right? Like these kids aren't going to make it on their own, right? And they need the support, because this is not, they're like, in a war-torn environment.
Orphans.
Yeah, orphans, basically. The supplies are limited, and their chance of survival is very low if they don't have any support system. I think in general, we can say that in any society. But I think in this situation, I think, because I've read interesting debates about like how the brother, he ends up basically killing his sister because he ends up leaving instead of just swallowing his pride and taking the abuse. What was interesting too is that the aunt says to the Seita that, what are you doing to like help with like the war effort? We're all trying to survive here. And they're traumatized, but like when she says that, she says that line, I think you start realizing that, in Japan, there's a mentality where, if you're not pulling your weight, then like, what are you doing for society? Like if you're not doing your part, we don't owe you anything, But I think what Takahata is trying to say is, these children are not, they're innocent in the circumstances of their history. Like Japan, is in this war, and as a nation, you need to defend your most vulnerable, because because you got to think about it, like if it wasn't for the fact that his mother died tragically in the beginning and his father, died at war, normally if let's say they had survived somehow, even if they surrendered, that family would be deemed as they're upstanding. They should be given like honors and stuff. But because they had those tragedies bestowed upon them, they were easily marginalized. And I think Takahata is actually speaking to his own people. That's why I find interesting, like you said, about when you watch like movies from a different, direct, like a
culture
different
and perspective.
Yeah, is that like they're not making it for us, even though I think this movie was popular in the West. Is that they're making it, like I said, to
Japanese culture. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think one of the most powerful scenes actually that I found in the film was actually how it starts off in the beginning, where you see Seda basically sort of homeless, and he's lost everything, right? And he has his sort of gummy camp, and you just see like all the pastors looking like, oh, look at another one. These people, they were just like talking smack to the people who had kind of lost everything. You know, that really sort of, I think, speaks to what the director was trying to say about society and how they treat their, like you were saying, their most vulnerable there. Obviously, like you just see this person there who's lying, lost everything, just homeless, and they really sort of judged him without understanding really what he had gone through in the war, losing everything.
Yeah.
At least I found that
Yeah, because
pretty powerful.
I think one of the main themes of this movie is pride. I think it's the pride of the brother who unfortunately jeopardizes his sister's life. And there's actually another powerful scene, I think, whenever he's collecting the money from so his mother had passed away, and his sister's malnourished, and so he's trying to get money to get food, and so he goes to the bank, and then because he's probably not following the news, somebody's talking, right, and says oh, we're surrendering, and he can't believe it. And even says
all the pride there. The Japanese Imperial Army.
How does the Great Japan surrender? Because, I think, again, speaking to, like you said, the culture and stuff, is that I think Takahata is trying to say to his audience that, yes, Seita had pride and he cost his sister's life. But as a nation, we had so much pride that we were not surrendering when we probably should have. And, there's I know that, like I said, we're from the American perspective, and now there's been this new revisionist history that, we didn't have to use the nukes. And I actually don't think that we had to use the nukes. But I think what's interesting that people forget is that in the Japanese perspective, the emperor and the elites were fighting so hard to not, because it was going to be such a pill to swallow. And that's one of the most, I think that one of the perspectives that a lot of academics here don't realize is that in Japan, there was a different mode of thinking about the war and about what it meant to be to actually surrender. It wasn't going to be so willy nilly. And I think, there's the other movies that you mentioned earlier, like Flags of Our Fathers and Letters of Iwo Jima, that kind of touch upon this. But I think, unfortunately, I'm seeing definitely in modern, let's say last 2 or 3 years, there's been a modern revisionist of only, to your point, only seeing it from the Western perspective. Oh, we didn't have to do this and X and Y. But what's powerful about this movie is that I think you start seeing that there was this great pride, and it cost them a lot, and it cost them maybe too much.
Well, yeah, Japan has, I mean, at least I know that they're a very proud country with a proud history. But yeah, I don't know if you necessarily needed to use the nukes during that war, during the context. I was not around at that time, and I've read quite a bit about World War II, but I'm still don't know what the answer is to that. But what I will say, and it's something you touched upon, even if you look at what happened with in samurai culture, when you lose or when you would die, rather than or to sort of, its pride is a big deal within their culture and honor. So when they were about to die, the samurai would commit suicide. He would kill himself to that end, and you would. So that's sort of the mentality that they were going with. You even had, fire or airplane pilots during World War II from Japan that were kamikaze. They would go in and they knew that they were going to try to inflict damage, and they would crash their planes there, right? And so that's sort of the mentality you're going with, or it's those sort of tactics would not necessarily be acceptable or normative in the West, in terms of Western fighting tactics. Most soldiers would not fly a plane knowing that they were going to commit suicide, right? But that was something that was more seen as a normal tactic, something you were going to sign up for in Japan, right? So it's really interesting hearing, Western academics come with their frame of mind talking about what should have happened, whereas you're not really looking at sort of Japanese perception of what was acceptable during that period of time as well, right?
Yeah.
These academics probably couldn't fathom flying a plane and then knowing that you were going to die, right? It's a different sort of perception.
Yeah, and I don't want to get too off on that topic, but I think it speaks to a new academic culture where they want to kind of view history with a modern morality and a modern lens, but it doesn't always work that cleanly. Again, this is why Studio Ghibli films in general, they're actually very nuanced. And what I mean by that, there's a lot of mini symbolism. So in this story, we've been jumping around, but we'll go back to the beginning. Mm-hmm. So obviously it opens up with, so you already know it's kind of a tragedy because it opens up with Seta like dying. And then you start with like when they're before like the tragedy start with the bombs and the mother getting unfortunately burned to death. But you see that throughout the story, right? There's many adults that fail in the story, right? So the doctor, your sister's malnourished. Just give her food. And he asks, mm-hmm. like, how do I get food? I have no food. The other adults, even like I agree that like he should have sucked up his pride and stay with his aunt. But the aunt was treating him like garbage. The farmer was like, oh, you should just swallow your pride, go to your aunt, and then obviously beats him up, Seta. Mm-hmm. My reading of that is that I think Takahata, because I know a little bit about his background, that he was a kid during this like time period. And also, if you weren't aware, and I'm for the audience too, is that this movie is actually based on a short story of not Takahata, a different author, about like that's what's sad about this. I think this movie is that it is partly based on an actual story of a brother and sister where his sister died, and it was because he was living in poverty. But I think Takahata, his interpretation, I think is I was getting at earlier with the adults failing, is that Takahata was also a child in this era. And I think he's saying to like, now they're long dead at the time, but I think what he's saying to a Japanese, basically the generation that raised him, that you have let us down because we have all this trauma because of the decisions you made, And I think we're youngish still, but we can say the same thing about Iraq or NAFTA. Like we look at this older generation going like, what were you doing? Like you're self-interested in selling us out,
Even bigger than that, at least because we were in high school when this happened, but the great financial crash was like something that is, I think, really scarred our generation.
Yeah. I agree with that. And like, we can leave that for a movie that I have movies up in the pipeline. but I think
I'm trying to review The Big Short next.
No, not The Big Short, but no, there's a different movie I'm picking, but there's plenty of movies around finance that it can lead us to that topic. But I mean, in the like I said, this Japanese perspective, where I think the adults failing is a symbol of that. I mean, that's just my reading of it, but I think maybe even if it's not intentional, I found that a bit profound because I think that is speaking, like I said, this generation of directors were heavily affected by the Reconstruction period and what the trauma that happened to adults. And what's interesting, like you were saying, is that we don't always get these perspectives. Mm-hmm. Because I imagine it because it's interesting how it's always talked about when you talk about Germany, the trauma of World War II and the Holocaust, but we don't often get that perspective about the trauma of Japanese society and culture of like, what is it like to lose such a war? Like it was a huge war. It wasn't just like a skirmish between two local powers. This was a world war, right? And I think these kind of films give us some insight into the generation that grew up in this trauma.
Sure. Yeah, just one thing to touch upon. I haven't seen any media covering this because Russia took the most toll, I would say, during World War II in terms of just casualty count. I'd be interested to see like how World War II really affected their society after, because I personally wouldn't know. I've read very little on that front.
Well, I mean, you would get the Stalin PR, so.
I meant from more of like, I can't remember the director's name that we reviewed Stalker from, what his perception would be of that.
Tarkovsky?
Like that. Yeah, Tarkovsky.
Yeah, I feel like Tarkovsky's, his critique is more, I mean, I haven't seen all his films, but it seems like his critique is more about the lies of the Soviet Union versus like the World War II. Because I think it's different to be victor. Because I think when you're victor, you can normalize all the losses, right? All the deaths, you can say it was worth it. We won. We defeated evil.
Yeah.
But when you're the loser, that's why like I think there's this Germany and Japan have these traumas. Is because when you're the loser, you're seen as in always normal media, normal history, right? Because like I think it was Napoleon who said that when victors write the history books, they're seen as the bad guys, and so they have to internalize that. So I think that's why there's also these dichotomy, and this is also why you see that like a lot of these like great directors who are now he died actually, I think Takahata, I forgot what year, but Miyazaki's like in his 90s, so he's also going to pass away too. But what you see is that there is, I think, a newer generation in Germany and Japan. They're not as traumatized with the war. So I think I think you're seeing a little resurgence of let's say another form of revisionist history. And I know that recently Shinzo Abe was he retired as prime minister, but he was probably one of the great symbols of this, where he comes from a family lineage where they didn't truly accept Japanese defeat, and
Sure.
they're ultra nationalistic. But I'm seeing a resurgence, especially with the rise of China, of I think Japanese
nationalism, sure,
of Japanese nationalism that you could probably have seen in like the 30s. And so we'll see what that leads to. But in the context of this movie, I think, the adults failing, like I said earlier, I think it's a symbol of a generation before them failing. But also, I think the social contract that if we're fighting this war, if we're all sacrificing everything, like the father's going to war, the mother staying at home, like where is the safety net if the worst happens? For a generation of Japanese citizens, there was no safety net. Americans helped rebuild eventually when they came in and after the aftermath, but there was a lot of people left behind. And there's also a very important scene, I think, in the movie when like these rich people go back to their homes. I think it's a small, short scene, but like after like I think the Seita and Setsuko die. They go back to their homes because often, like, no matter, it's just universal. No matter what war or society, it reminds me of like the stories of like with the royal family in the World War II, they fled to Scotland. I was like, wait, but I've seen the movies and I've read the books of like the people in London in the tunnels. Oh, but the royal family gets to go to Scotland and
Dude,
escape.
Of course, man. It's kind of like the same thing because you live up in the Northeast. We were just talking about how some people are saying New York's done, and it's like people who are freaked out. Oh, this is sort of an invisible enemy that we're facing with COVID, right? And where do a lot of these more affluent New Yorkers who are really transplants end up going? Let me go to the Hamptons. Let me go to Miami and just right this ship, right? And then once everything's settled and all done, then I'll go back to like my usual life, regardless of all the collateral damage that's happened. Same thing.
Yeah, because I think the film is also touching upon how, like, in this era, and in maybe in general Japanese society, and I think any society really, this is why I think the movie is a bit universal, is that the most vulnerable in your society end up paying the highest costs for these big, let's say, historical events or mistakes.
I would say historical events. I mean, look at the event we're currently going through right now, right? Don't mean to get super political, but the people who get bailed out are not your average most vulnerable. They tend to be people with a lot of resources.
Yeah. So I think this is why this movie has passed the test of time, as they say, that old adage, is because you can still come with, like, let's say, like, not really understanding Japanese culture, but you can take away, I think, some of the great universal messages that are coming out of this movie. Because I think it speaks more not about war, but about society, expectations, and also like social contract, and like how do you treat the most vulnerable in your society in these times of crisis. And Japan, and like I think like most countries do, if you're expendable, you're expendable, unfortunately. And these two children were expendable. As much as I think he should have swallowed his pride to the ant, sure, and that's my personal take, there's still something has to be said about, like, where was the other social network? Where were the government officials? Where was the doctor? They were all, and the police officer was nice to him, but still let him say, oh, go figure it out. In the end, everybody turned a blind eye,
It was really a sort of pull yourself by your own bootstraps type of mentality, right? At least that's how it was treated in this film. But it goes to show, when you've lost everything, how do you do that? You don't even have boots to pull yourself up from.
These are also children. It's not like, even though I still think it's tough for adults too, but these are definitely children, and they're not going to be able to. So that's why, like, the second time I viewed it, because I already knew what was going to happen, but I remember, like, the first time being kind of affected. Obviously I was a kid, but I think the second time, even though you can be sad, you have to recognize that, like, from the beginning, it looked like they were
the deck was stacked against them.
Yeah. So I want to touch upon some of the aesthetics of the film. Mm-hmm. Obviously it's a Studio Ghibli film, so obviously the animation's top notch, but I forgot how great the soundtrack is in this movie. I thought
it was great. I really like the vibe and the pace of this film, and some of especially like, what do you call it? The candy drops were just such an integral part of, like, the storyline of the film.
Yeah, the fruit drops. Yeah,
the fruit drops. Was there? I guess I wanted to ask you: was there like a deeper meaning that you saw there? Because that's sort of how they started the story and how they ended it with.
I honestly I didn't have a deeper reading on that. I will say that
Yeah,
having watched a lot of anime myself is that I will say maybe if there's a deeper meaning, it's the fact that it looks cute. So yeah, I remember like how
yeah.
anime children are drawn. Even when the honestly like it's so when you feel those emotional tugs, it's because they're doing these tricks for like the
I
she's
guess
dying. She's dying, but she looks like still cute. I'm like, okay, like what are you doing to me here?
yeah.
like,
I mean, I guess I just like the fruit drop touch because yeah, like some of my favorite candies as a little kid, I could kind of relate to that. Like just being like, yeah, can I have one more? Where the you can relate to this, I'm sure. It's like growing up in like Mexican households, you had the little De La Rosa marzipan like candies. Used to love those as a kid. Be like, can I
oh, the
have one more?
mazapanes. Yeah, I love the
Yeah,
mazapanes. I probably why I'm fat is because of that damn freaking dulce.
those candy. If you've never
Yeah,
tried them, you should go
I would
try them.
eat
They're so
one.
good.
I would eat one. I'd be like, oh, this is like it's because it's like so light. I'd be like, oh, the box gone. And then I look at the back. I'm like, I was a kid. I was like, that's a lot of calories. I could take it. But I'm like, as I get older, I'm like, what am I doing? That's like 4,000 calories.
Those
Yeah.
candies, yeah. Growing up, if you grew up in a Mexican household, anyone can relate to that. I'm sure in any culture you have your candy, and those things were like
It's
they were
unhealthy, especially
crack.
when
Oh, they were not good for you.
my mom would bring back pan dulce. I was just like, okay, like you might as well tell me like I'm gonna have diabetes.
Mexican families love their sweets, man.
Yeah.
But anyway, yeah. So that sort of tug of just like I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that when I was a kid. Like we didn't have like the fruit drops, but we had like the marzipan. I'd always like be like, yo, to my parents when my brother can have another. It's just something that sort of brings you back to your childhood a little bit.
Speaking of the film, I think what's interesting is also that it's anti-war but not anti-American. So you see some of the American
I don't know.
planes, but it's really a focus, like I said, on
Yeah, but
Japanese culture, people at that place in history, and that unfortunately that trauma.
they didn't. I don't even think I remember them mentioning America once in the film. It was just them referring to the war.
Yeah, yeah, and then I think the only real reference is when the planes when they zoom in. Sometimes you'll see the
Oh,
and
I
that looks.
don't even remember seeing the flag.
Oh, that's
Something
it's not it's yeah because there's the stars and let's be honest that's us so.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I obviously we know the context having grown up here. I just don't remember seeing in the film if they actually referred to like the U.S., if you will, as the enemy.
Yeah, and I think that's a smart touch because I think it's easy. Like, I'm never gonna make us do this film, but like I've seen Rambo, and that Rambo is like a perfect example of like propaganda film where it's like, oh, America save the world type of thing. And I think,
What's
and
funny is they were made around the same time.
yeah. And what's also interesting is that I think you're seeing this also in Chinese cinema. I'm doing some initial research, and it seems like there's movies that like, yeah, it's like basically they have their own versions of Rambo now, where it's like China saving the world, saving Africa, and it's actually the Americans that are like the evil doers.
I mean, we would do that with the Russians, right? And like the Die
Yeah,
Hard series.
yeah. So I think that's why I give credit to this film because it's easy to fall into that, even if you're trying not to. But I think he wants to. I think my interpretation is that still he wants to make it really sure that he wants to hone it in. That's a referendum, not on pro-war, anti-war, but about as a society we failed like people, and we need to recognize that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree with that assessment. I mean, you see it within this horrible tragedy, really. Um, but so I guess that was one other thing I wanted to ask. Did I guess what was the deep because the movie is called Grave of the Fireflies, right? So what do you think is sort of the meaning behind the Fireflies?
I can have my own guess, but I feel like if I haven't read the short story. I feel like the short story would probably hint what it is. I think I actually don't know. Like I thought about this, but I feel like I'm in the blind if I haven't read the short story or like have more context. I feel like there's probably some symbolism for sure, because the title is literally lift off, from the short. But I'm curious about. I wonder if you did any reading or you have any thoughts on that because like I'm gonna say like I'm gonna just refrain.
Yeah, I'm not. I didn't do any additional reading or beyond that. I mean, there were just the two initial scenes where you really see the Fireflies. One when Setsuko was a little afraid to be sleeping in the shelter in the dark. So then Sato was like, "Oh, well, we can just bring fireflies," and then they bring him in, and then it just lights up in a really magical way their sort of shelter, right? But then the next day they die, and then Setsuko ends up burying all the fireflies into the grave, right? And I was trying to find some of the meaning, and I couldn't quite. Maybe, yeah, I don't know. I'd probably refrain because I couldn't quite pin out any deeper meaning or why they would include those two scenes necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, even though I've, like I said, play a lot of Japanese video games and watch anime, I will say that sometimes with Japanese titles and also symbolisms, they're definitely foreign to us because we're from a different Western perspective. Because like there are things that like their titles like make sense. Like I said, if you were raised in this culture, so I get the feeling that the grave and the firefly, there is probably some meaning there. The only thing I can think of off the top of my head is that like fireflies only come out in the dark, right? And you can see that they're around because of their lights, and maybe they're trying to illuminate that. You know, we as I'm not saying me, I'm not Japanese, but as a society, we haven't looked at this dark part closely enough. That we like to refrain and ignore it, and that we haven't acknowledged some of the deeper underlying root causes of why we went through this trauma. And because I think the firefly to me, I think because you only see them really, you know that they're around in the darkness. I feel like there is a message there. And then the grave aspect, I think it's because, let's be honest, there were people who died in the war and people who died because of the war. If you know that, the difference, right? So
you're just referring to that as Japanese society then? Yeah,
I think there's a little hint there because I feel like it's because it might be like, it could be maybe to be more direct, it could be like its meaning is that it's the grave of those who we don't recognize. Like we recognize the soldiers,
or have forgotten, right?
Yeah, the forgotten.
You only care about them when the lights are on. You don't really care about them once they're dead.
Yeah, and I think
that's a more brutal interpretation.
Well, I think it's because this is a brutal film in many ways. Like even though there's no blowing up, there's no like there's
people's homes getting caught on fire.
Yeah, but it's not like I've seen like other war movies or even like anime films that are a little more, let's say,
direct.
Yeah, direct. This was definitely like it wants you to peel away the violence and look like actually like a bit deeper into like
Oh, so I had another question regarding this film. Do you think that Seda made the right decision in not telling Setsuko what happened to their mother? And the second question, or sort of a follow up, do you think it was right of the aunt to tell Setsuko that?
I think, unfortunately, I understand why he didn't want to tell her initially, because of like the mother was in terrible shape and she died pretty suddenly, and it would have been very traumatic for his sister for sure. I don't know honestly, it's one of those things where I remember watching it and going like, oh, you know what? Yeah, it's too brutal. Cute anime child. And the aunt, I think the aunt definitely was out of line to just because how the aunt character was, I knew she just blurted it out too, like probably off camera.
Oh yeah, no emotion.
Yeah, but I think unfortunately it's one of those. I'm gonna use another adage where it's like there's never the right time. You know how they say about breakups sometimes there's never the right time. I think that unfortunately he could have picked later or in that moment or like right after that moment, it would have been still as devastating. Yeah. So I think unfortunately that one, I can't say he was right or wrong, but I think he would have been wrong if he waited eternally, but I don't think there was a right time because for those kind of things, there never is a right time. So.
No, I mean, yeah, I agree with you. I get that. It's just the aunt's character in this film was just so interesting. And what always it killed me was just her sort of arrogance or like her lack of compassion when they sell the mother's kimonos to barter for rice, and then they're like, "Yeah, can we have some rice?" No, you didn't do anything to earn this rice. It's like we just sold off my mom's possessions for the rice, and we can't have any. I was like, that's heartless, man. I was like, I get that you view that they're not doing anything for the war effort, but I mean, they lost their mom, man, and they're selling off the last of their possessions, and you wouldn't have this rice if they didn't do that.
Yeah. I mean, and she also tries to like tell him like, oh, find your other relatives. Don't your mom have relatives? They don't know how to contact them. So she viewed him as a nuisance. She was only, it's interesting. She was only like, humoring, I don't want to say humoring, but like keeping them in the home because again, going back to your honor point earlier when we just started the conversation,
Mhm.
she still felt somewhat honor bound to at least do the minimal. Right. Oh, but you know, she was nagging them the whole time and it got to the point where Seita couldn't take it anymore. But I think again that speaks to again not just that character, but I think also how like you know the movie's kind of messaging you about like okay we do the minimum, but we really don't want to. It's kind of like
Yeah,
it's
but
one of those
to
dark
be
realities.
to be fair to the aunts, from the aunts' perspective, I'm like, they weren't always the most respectful of guests either. They didn't clean up after themselves for like that was the one scene where you see like a bunch of dirty dishes there. So
Yeah,
I don't know if he was trying to say anything deeper there too.
I think the only thing I'll say deeper is that because I think this is important in general in Japanese society that yeah they almost were like not aware of the world around them. Like they weren't. I don't want to use the word socialized because they talked and they acted like normal people. It wasn't like they didn't know about society, but they're almost as if they were like ignorant, right? Like oh, they
Ignorant,
act.
they didn't care. I feel like they were more
Yeah,
like American kids in some ways.
exactly. So I think the messaging there was kind of like what happens when you lose that family structure and there's nobody there to like instill let's say good values because as much as Takahata is condemning a generation before him, I also think that he's also saying if you're children who are not raised in a good family structure also lost. So I think you
Sure,
gotta remember that this is still a generation that probably had stronger traditional family values than I
very
think a
much
lot
so.
of, let's say like modern um you know modern family I don't
Dynamics
know
happen.
dynamics. Yeah. Um, but I think there was that messaging too because I think there's also messaging about how like youth need to be properly cultivated and like they have to show respect because obviously they were guests and they were in many ways refugees and like they didn't. Cause that's where like the second time I viewed it. The first time I viewed it, obviously when you're a child, you like I said, you take everything front facing. And so I was like, I didn't like the ant, but now I'm older and I've watched a lot more anime, watched a lot more films, books. I don't view the ant so harshly anymore. I still think she was still the adult and had the responsibility to suck up her own pride. So everybody talks about the pride of the brother, but she had her own pride. She could have at least like they both should have compromised, but they didn't, right? And
No,
so and I think that's also a message there is that like I think
you need a compromise for a good ending.
yeah, often many times, but
Yeah,
they both chose not to. Obviously I'm an adult now, so I think the onus is that it's still a little bit more on the adult, even though I do think Seita made a grave mistake that ended up costing them their lives, and that's the ultimate price to pay, unfortunately.
yeah.
But the aunt should have been an adult and should have realized that like these children just don't have they've lost like their family structure and that she probably should instead of like teasing them and pushing them away should probably be a little more stringent with them like you said make them do the dishes make them cook. Why was she cooking everything? She could have made the Seita cook, but she really wanted to alienate them, I feel like. So
Dude, I love that little backhanded. It was a very passive move that Seita went about by getting the what was it the stove cooker, and it pissed
yeah.
the aunts off quite a bit. And that kind of made me laugh a bit. But yeah, you just see sort of that dynamic was just quickly unraveling between Seita Setsuko and their aunt. Because you see it right after they made their own meal and their rice, and they started, being a little more like alleviating some of the responsibility from the aunt in terms of cooking for them. But then, right after Seda had finished his meal, he just goes from his sort of cross legs, proper stance, and just begins to like relax and unwind. And even Setsuko's like, "Dude, you can't do that. It's disrespectful." He's like, "We can do whatever we want." So like it was just interesting seeing that sort of shift in mentality where Setsuko just really didn't care about typical Japanese norms.
Yeah, I mean, another character I want to talk about is the farmer because he's like here
Oh
and
yeah,
there. But I think what's interesting is that the scene where they're like, like they accidentally fall into the like vegetable farm. I say vegetable farm, and they start eating. That's when I think you realize that they've hit the low, like it's
The
not going to
lowest
end.
point. Yeah.
Yeah, they're not. It's not going to end well for them because even the sister says, "Should we be eating this?" And he's like, "Yeah, we have to, right? And we have to steal this stuff." I think once he starts stealing, you realize that this guy's definitely like.
Well, and then you start to once he does that, he starts going down the rabbit hole, right? Where like you do it once, and then it becomes an over and over thing, and then he finally gets caught one night by the farmer.
Yeah, and then there's also that scene where even though he's been caught, like he's normalized that behavior, and I think that, again that speaks to what I think the movie was saying around like when you don't have that good structure, you end up in a bad place because he actually sees. There's that scene where he actually sees the American planes, and he's actually happy they're there because that's his opportunity to go steal.
Yeah, raid.
Yeah, and so
I love how he steals and then tries to go resell stuff to his aunt.
Yeah.
I was like, wow, you've really hit the low point at that.
Yeah, that's when you realize that
that was the lowest to me because I feel like that's even like your pride is completely vanished, or any sort of pride that you did have when you go ask your aunt for like money or like to barter for things she sold.
Yeah, I think that's what. Yeah, to your point, I think that's when you realize that.
Things are going down fast.
It like when you're like when they talk often about like what happens when you're in poverty and how like your mindset changes and how like you view life totally differently. That's what happened to them. Is that
or when you become a drug addict and you'll do whatever it takes. You've just sacrificed everything. The one thing
you've normalized all your actions because you're trying to survive. Basically.
Sure. The one thing that I didn't quite get, and I will criticize Sage's character for this. Why did he wait so long to withdraw the money?
I think that's a good question. On my viewing, I feel like it was because it was kind of like I think he probably viewed it as their last ditch safety net if they needed it, right? But he kind of probably could have used that earlier.
Yeah, that's his naivety because it was to the point where, dude, when you're trying to when you're resorting to raiding things when bombings are occurring, that's the time point where like, all right, you need to pull out the money. So I don't know. Maybe it was just maybe it was his arrogance that we could just write it out. But it cost that action more so than staying with the that action. I would say was the most responsible for.
You know what? I think you're onto something there about the arrogance of waiting it out because for the longest time, until he picked up the money, he thought his dad was going to come back. They were going to win the war. So if you think about it, right, he kept writing to his dad, right? And then at the end, when he learns that they've surrendered, he's like, well, then this is probably why my dad didn't write back because the guy says, oh, yeah, the Navy's totally destroyed. There's like nobody left. So he makes the assumption that, okay, my dad probably died a long time ago. And it's dawning on him. So, but he only gets that information when he goes to get the money, right? So I think he was holding off that like, oh, my dad's just busy, you know, he'll come back for us, you know. I guess as a kid, you know, that's the thing. I think that's why I think why they're child characters, not adults, because I think you can kind of empathize with a child who thinks that like their parents or at least their dad will come back, you know, that he's just at war, you know. Obviously, he died. That whole family died. Actually, if you really think about it.
Yeah, they all did. In the end, it doesn't. Even Sada's character dies right at the beginning anyway.
Yeah, he dies as well. Yeah, he's the last one to die, but they all die.
Yeah. So, kind of circling back to this. Yeah, I like how they used the sort of the candy box, the fruit drop box, as a way to sort of circle back. Remember, he gets chucked by one of the officers in the field, and then that sort of recycles back to like when they were just starting off as kids and sort of the story. I really like that little trick of having the story begin.
Yeah, I mean it's a good storytelling right when they wrap it from like the beginning wraps to the end. You know,
I thought that was really nicely done.
Yeah, the fruit box. Yeah, that was nicely done. Yeah, I mean this is one of those. I mean, Takahata is often considered like the underrated Studio Ghibli director. I haven't seen all his movies. I've actually watched more Miyazaki ones, which is obviously he's the headliner. But Takahata is considered like often underrated, actually. So because Oshii, everybody loves Oshii. I mean, I have to go to I have to go to like you go to any anime forum and you say Oshii's bad, they're gonna just like kill you. But unfortunately, I don't think Takahata gets talked up as often because I think. as he's a contemporary of Miyazaki, he won an Academy Award, Spirited Away. It's hard for him to get the same kind of
Recognition.
recognition. But obviously, those who watch a lot of his movies or know of him know that he's a really good director. And actually, he's directed a lot of films that I think they're kind of like similar in style, where like there's a lot of little detail, little nuances that you have to watch carefully. This is, even though this movie's simple in its storyline, there's a lot of little details that let us pick apart and make actually a good podcast experience, because there is a lot of intricate detail. Well, like if we did let's say like a Die Hard, it's kind of like we're just talking about the scenes and like obviously the patriotism or whatever. But in this movie, there's a lot of little details that you can have like blog posts on. So
it's the little subtleties which make this film pretty interesting, or like what is not being said. Like the idea of like pride and arrogance, and how that really both sides are failing each other without really saying that they are explicitly.
Yep. Exactly.
But yeah, I really enjoyed this film. I like the sort of the style and the animation, because I didn't know which studio actually produced this. You said it was Studio Ghibli.
Yeah, I mean, this is the stuff I know, so unfortunately.
Yeah, oh no, I mean, you are more ingrained in the anime culture than I am, but I like the animation style and the pace of the film. I like, I thought the director did a great job in Takahata in where he took this film, and sort of some of the broader context of what he was trying to say about Japanese society.
Yeah, and in this movie, I know we're going to get to ratings and final thoughts in a second, but I will say that, like, having seen many Studio Ghibli films, not all of them, but decent amount, it has the same trademark style where, like, they do emphasize, like, fluidity of movement. So that's a studio that does emphasize, like, how people move. Like, Miyazaki always talks about how, like, he actually studies, like, he looks at people, how they move, how they walk, because he wants to bring that to the animation, which is why I think their studio has such a great reputation with, like, I think the Western Academy Awards, because their movies are very, like, enjoyable to watch with the eyes. I think, we did Ghost in the Shell earlier, and that was what studio was that? I think it was Production IG. I mean, it was still great movie, animated really well. I still liked it, but you could see the differences in, like, just
style.
I think some little nuances of, like, the arm motion and, like, the head fake and not the face. Like, this where Studio Ghibli makes its money. They're really good at that. I mean, they are one of the few studios that really still adhere to, even if they're using computer enhancements, and this is not like they did a HD of this movie, but at the time it was all hand drawn stills. So, and I think Ghost in the Shell too was, but you can tell that they really put an emphasis on, like, how just people walk and move. Like that beach scene. I know that we didn't talk about specific scenes, unfortunately, but like, how how their feet played in the water. I mean, that's just like animation gold, man. Like,
no, it was good. Like, I mean, like I said, this movie was very fluid, and I did enjoy that pace.
Yeah, we got to get you to get some. We got to do some anti. If there's Studio Ghibli on one side, I got to find you a movie where you're like, "What is this? What am I looking at?"
Why?
Because it's an interesting contrast of, like,
I mean, the Wild style to me was still when we separately watched Serial Experiments Lane. That was quite the series, man. And the animation style was totally different there.
Yeah, it's different style, different philosophy.
Whoa,
yeah. I mean, yeah, we'll see. I mean, I have a lot on my backlog, but we'll see if I can eventually recommend a film that has a little more, like, still great animation, but a little more, let's say, like, experimental style. So
I'm trying to see who I can't find this. Oh, the Studio Triangle staff made Serial Experiments Lane.
I don't think they're around anymore, but the
ceased operations in 2002.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
I don't think Serial Experiments Lane made any money.
No, but there was a phenomenal series.
Yeah, the studios that, like, really are making good, I think they're really, like, they haven't figured out the formula, is probably Kyoto Animation. They made Violet Evergarden. So for the audience, if you're looking more and you want more, like, I want to say tear jerkers, I think it's called Violet of the Evergarden. I'm trying to get the title right. Sorry. Yeah, the Violet Evergarden, not of the Violet Evergarden. It's on Netflix, I believe. I totally recommend that for the audience or yourself if you want. It has some war themes, but mainly it's about I would say it's about, like, identity, self-worth, self-love, and also just how do you actually, here's where it's common, how do you deal with trauma? So that's a right up there for the
So some Eva themes there.
no, Eva is like
That's
Eva
pretty
is like
much everything you listed is basically an Eva.
Eva. I don't want to get into Evangelion, but like I might one day pick some of those newer movies. But that movie is not just about trauma. That thing is about that. That's
Oh,
like
way more, but yeah, a lot of the themes in the series are like that you listed. It's like
it's not. I will say that it's not an emotional like little tearjerker. Okay, Eva is just dark as hell sometimes. Yeah. But this one is very very like in the vein of like beautiful animation, in the sense of like I mean, even how one character walks on water, you're like, what kind of unlimited budget? Like, but in the same sense of like, it's not like overly violent or anything. It's more of a focus on like characters, dialogue, and like, those kind of like tougher conversations and moments, with Eva, and that's a shorthand for Evangelion for the audience if they're not aware. I could talk for 4 hours about that.
Yeah.
So
anyway, so what did you think? Like, I guess because you watched so many anime, you watched like hundreds. How would you rate this film compared to like all the other films that we've done?
So I actually didn't look up my my on my list for my rating, but I suspect that I'm gonna be rating it the same in the same ballpark.
Okay.
I give it a solid 8.5 out of 10. It's a good movie. I definitely recommend it to the audience and to other individuals. It's just that I've seen movies that are just better, and Ghost in the Shell is one of them. But there's other movies that I'm thinking of on the top of my head right now that I'm just like, oh, like this movie was good, but there's other movies that I liked more.
Yeah.
But this movie is definitely a solid. And actually, rewatching it for the second time, I would say that this is one of those films that like I think put Studio Ghibli on the map in a sense, because this is definitely a movie that, like you were saying earlier, I think a lot of people who are like, you said, Canadian or American or European, I think they probably were like, even if they had their Western lens, they were probably taken aback about some of the messaging and some of the other perspective on a war that was, like I said, universal.
Yeah, so this is going to be surprising because I actually rated this about an 8.5 as well. I really enjoyed. I've not watched nearly the multitude of animes that you have, but I really enjoyed sort of the pace of this film. Some of the themes that they were trying to get. I really like the context that Takahata was trying to go with the storyline of this film. And honestly, we don't talk about this enough, but rewatchability was definitely, I feel like, even though I've rated films higher that I would say are not quite as rewatchable, this one's sort of easy to like digest. It's an hour 25. I didn't think there were any sort of needless scenes within the film. And yeah, I thought rewatchability would be pretty high. Like I could go tomorrow and watch it again.
You say that, but I mean, I can as well. But I will say that I've read many times that a lot of people can't rewatch this movie again. It's too emotionally. I
felt like I could personally. And we'll always point this out with Stalker, which we both rated very high. Rewatchability on that film is not great.
I would definitely rewatch Stalker.
But I would rewatch it, but I would probably
watch it
back to back.
But I think, but I mean with Stalker, even when I want to rewatch it, I'm probably gonna watch 1 hour at a time. That's the honest.
Exactly.
I'm not watching the whole. Like I think I did it in 2 sittings, but even then, I felt like, wow, this is a long movie. And I'm like, okay, like I need to break this up for like 4 days, maybe.
It was almost 3. It was close to 3 hours long, that movie.
It was a bit over. It was like 3 hours. It was super long. It was like 3 hours and like or something. It was like ridiculous.
I did it 2 sittings. It was too much.
Yeah, it was a great movie, but I have to like break it up now. Like, and now I feel like I'm gonna cheat and be like, oh, I'm gonna just go to the scenes I want to watch. Yeah.
So when they're debating whether or not to go in the room.
Exactly. But this movie's definitely, and I think in general, this is one of the beauties that Studio Ghibli does have, and I think this is why they do well at the Academy Awards in the foreign film category, is because their movies are not just universal, but they're very digestible. Like just how they're presented, and like even if there's some nuances, like you said, it flows. You get the gist. There are other anime films that like never really broke it in the West. The Ghost in the Shell is actually a good example of this. Like, it didn't break until much later when they saw the Matrix connection. That people started
Yeah,
watching
well,
it. Um,
there would be no Matrix without Ghost in the Shell.
yeah, and I think in general, there's other films that I've enjoyed a lot too that I know that have not broken in really the let's say when I say Western, I mean
The Western
obviously
market, yeah,
I already know that the anime fandom knows about them, but I mean like when you talk
mainstream.
when you talk to mainstream, like these people who only watch to say every now and then, you're only gonna get like what's really like playing in that market, right? That's how it is nowadays with streaming. So
I mean, what was the film? Totoro is like an example of a film
great
that's
movie.
really, yeah, but it's really made broken into beyond just the anime, cult following here
I'm
into
actually
the
happy
mainstream.
you brought that up because here's a trivia for the audience. My Neighbor Totoro and this film, I think, were made, if not back to back, simultaneously. So by the studio,
Really?
so they're cranking it out. Yeah, I please
Wow.
fact check me, but I going off my memory, I it was like very very close timing. Yeah, I think that's
I'm
a trivia question.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that My Neighbor Totoro was also made in '88, so I wouldn't be surprised if they were sort of, back-to-back projects. Yeah, it was made in the same year. So yeah,
Yes, no,
man, Studio Ghibli was cranking them out in '88.
yeah, it's that late '80s, up to the mid '90s, where you could argue that it's the peak of their productivity, even though like probably the peak global attention was Spirited Away, which I've
Hmm.
already seen like too many times. The
I've never actually watched Spirited Away. I gotta
You
check
should
it out.
watch it. It's a great movie. But it's overplayed too much. I mean, when I was a kid, when we were like Adult Swim would always play it all the time, and I was just like, this is way too much. Now,
Hmm.
yeah, I mean, audience, if you haven't seen it, you should definitely watch that. The other great one that I think is also great from Studio Ghibli is Princess Mononoke. I think it's called. That's a great one. Another good one from Miyazaki is Nausea Valley of the Wind. Again, I'm probably getting these titles wrong, but I've seen these. There's others I want to watch, but these are really good, and they all have their own themes. Like the Nausea Valley of the Wind is an environmentalist film, and then actually a lot of Miyazaki's films are actually environmentalist. Now that I'm thinking about it, but yeah, these it's tough. Like if you study how that industry works, like the amount of like drawings and refining and stuff it is a lot of work and a lot of hours. So credit to them. So like you said, they were definitely cranking it out. But yeah,
Yeah.
I will leave it at that. I was actually surprised our scores did align, but obviously for different reasons, which was interesting. Why didn't it go higher on your list? You seemed like you really enjoyed it.
I really liked it, but I don't know. Maybe it is a slight bias towards of like anime as opposed to like actual live action films, where it's like I feel like animes do have kind of a ceiling as opposed to like live action films to me. Maybe that's a little bit of an inherent bias.
I think that's a natural bias that most people have actually in the West. I would say that like in general, I don't know if I've actually given an anime film a 10 out of 10. I know I've given series, but I don't know if I've given a film. I think the problem sometimes is
Yeah, you
they're,
can't.
they're usually short. That's the thing. Like they're usually
They're
like,
short. That's
they're
why.
usually like 90 minutes. And I just wish they could keep going and elaborate. But with a series, sometimes you get like 20 episodes and you're like, oh yeah, this is so good. Um,
Yeah, I mean there have been like I'd say anime series here in the West that I've absolutely loved. Boondocks being one of them for different reasons, but yeah, like Serial Experiments Lane was like that's as close to 10 as it's going to get, and that was like fantastic to me. So I think it also depends. Like this was great and I went into, and it was interesting, but it just wasn't long enough. And I don't know what this film could have done more. It's just I couldn't rate it quite higher.
but I will say this, and I like that you have a different perspective because I've always had the suspicion with Studio Ghibli that they make really good 8.5, 9 out of 10s. And I feel like like I was saying, there's other films I'm thinking of back of my head that I was like I would give like 9.5, maybe even 10. And I'm like, and I've never ever done that with a
So
Studio Ghibli.
yeah, I think as much as we are praising, the pace and fluidity of this and the motion I feel like I've seen other films that were similar in this style, and maybe that's why, like, the storyline and everything is different, but it's still the same. It's nothing sort of genre bending about it or super unique to me. Maybe that's where some of my criticism is coming into. Like
Yeah,
when
but yeah,
I
go
will
ahead.
say, like when I saw Studio Experience Lane, I've seen several animes. Nothing was in like that was super unique to me.
and you're never gonna see anything like it again. So
Yeah.
but no, but I think in general, like this happens with, I think, like ignoring anime. I think there's a lot of movies that like and directors included, that they're good at this. They're good at like that 8.5 out of 10,
You know,
and like
it's kind of
they don't ever hit it out of the park, you know.
yeah, but it's like that. They have that same style. It's kind of like you kind of expect more or less like the plot's gonna be a little different, but it's you know kind of what you're getting, right? It's kind of like with Marvel movies in a way. It's that same style. You know kind of what to expect. There's gonna be some different intricacies, different storylines, but kind of the I don't know. It's kind of like insert in a way, and like you're saying, Studio Ghibli, they have that same sort of style that you come to expect when you watch one of their films.
Yeah.
Yeah. Anyway, I think that's sort of our final thoughts on the movie. We both enjoyed it. We both, I think, will recommend watching this film if you haven't seen it. If you've enjoyed our commentary on this movie, please like and subscribe, and stay tuned for next week's episode. You take care.